So, welcome back. This time we are going to actually talk about what the hell the personality situation debate was about. Last time I gave you context about the devastating academic job market and kind of how it shaped David Funder, as well as give you some more background on Walter Mischel and how they're not far off from each other. But I'm using them as kind of like the personifications of the debate. So let's get started. So, the person-situation debate. The fundamental question is this: which is more important for determining what people do? The person, as in like personality, or the situation? So like the situation you find them in. So Walter Mischel wrote a book in 1968 that was called Personality and Assessment. And it is characterized as arguing that behavior is too consistent across situations for individual differences to be characterized by traits. That's how the book is characterized. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to this book, but why is this important? So, as I keep saying, this is central to how we think about personality. Is it stable across situations or inconsistent across situations? This has implications for understanding individual differences and their basis and influence in important life outcomes. Now, I'm going to spoil this and tell you that this is almost a false dichotomy. The person matters, the situation matters, and they interact. Spoilers. So here are the three big debate aspects. 1. Does the personality of an individual transcend the immediate situation and provide a consistent guide to actions? So, or is what a person does utterly dependent on the situation at the time? Does personality matter or not? Which is driving. And as I illustrated way back in module 1 or module 0, even under the most extreme situations, people still differ. So here are the other 2 points. Or the 3 questions. So, are common, ordinary intuitions about people fundamentally flawed or basically correct? So, the intuition is that people have personalities. Are they wrong? And kind of the third burning question that tends to be had. 1 second. Is why do psychologists continue to argue about the consistency of personality? And so what is situationalism? So situationalism is the belief that behavior is largely, definition, situationalism. Belief that behavior is largely driven by the situation and that personality is relatively unimportant. So if the situationalists are correct, there's no reason to study personality theories because traits and personality don't exist. There's no reason to have this class. Okay, bye! Obviously, we do exist. There is some personality, but this last one is kind of more of an old guard argument, so I've got a second bubble. I have never had this argument, like, genuinely with other people about personality, like, being important or not. I do remember that witnessing these debates between various personality psychologists, which is fascinating. But, like, and I've got great colleagues who are, like, social psychologists, and we don't have these debates, which is really nice and comforting. Because it's settled. Both matter. which is nice. But these are compelling arguments. So, like, these are the three issues. First argument, that the situationalist piece, that there is an upper limit to how well one can predict a person, and that depends on based on any measure of that person's personality, and this upper limit is really low. And in this book, Walter Mischel looked at relationships of self, informant, and behavioral data with behavioral data. So he looked at reports of personality and if they predicted behavior. So back to this upper limit. Yeah, there is an upper limit, and personality is not a great predictor of behavior. Traits can't be used to... So part of this is a measurement issue from the 70s or 60s. Yeah, so measurement has come a long way. But traits can't be used to predict behavior accurately enough to be useful, like for a specific behavior. And this is important because the best test of usefulness of traits is whether they predict behavior. So when Walter Mischel looked at these, he looked at like the ability of trait judgment by self and informants to predict behavior using versus using past behavior to predict future behavior. Most of these were in the lab, and his analysis found that correlations rarely exceeded 0.3. Now, there was a reanalysis of this done, and in reality, like the average, like correlations did exceed 0.3. They would go up to 0.4, and the argument was these correlations were small and can't be used to predict behavior. That's the argument. Again, I don't really believe this argument, but yeah. So honestly, here's the counter argument to this. So that it's an unfair selective literature review by Mischel. It was not a systematic review. And a systematic review kind of goes through like and outlines the procedure you do to identify every study. I've done systematic reviews, or I like to call them censuses. So like I've done a census of like 2 years of articles in one journal, Behavior Genetics, to just see what people are doing, and I just cover all of them. Like I just picked a journal and like went into it. And so Walter Mischel didn't really do that. And a lot of the studies he picked were methodologically problematic. They had poor measurement quality, and predictive validity, like your ability to make predictions is only as good as the quality of your measure. And so if you have a bad measure, you can't predict above and beyond how reliable that test is. So if it's got a like if its reliability is 0.5, you can't get a correlation above 0.5. You just can't. So it's capped. So, but even within this selective literature review, there was evidence of consistency. And as I put in here, part of the problem with the poor methodology was that personality measurement was in its infancy. Measurement has come such a long way since the 1960s. Like, it is way better. The reliabilities they were working with were awful. Scale developed factor analysis even was still a very expensive technique to use. So here's the broader response. So we can do better. Because, yeah, there are some good points here. We can do better. Personality, psychology, that 0.4 limit is likely because of poor methodology. So you have to get out of the laboratory. So personality is more likely to be relevant in real, vivid, and important situations. And it's good to study individual consistency as a moderator to examine, because not everyone is equally consistent. And that level of consistency is helpful in prediction. Those that are less consistent, you really shouldn't expect to be able to predict them as well. But the super consistent people, they're great for prediction. Now, there's also kind of a little quirk here focusing on behavior. So when you measure, like when you use the same kind of data, so like behavior predicting behavior, you get an extra bump in correlation just because they're in the same method. It's called method variance. But unfortunately, all of this is really hard to do, like getting out of the lab, and there's this focus on behavioral trends because that's what social psychologists are interested in. While with personality, we tend to not be interested in the individual action because it's less predictive. Instead, you kind of look at aggregate behaviors that accumulate over time. So long-term outcomes, way more effective to be predicted by personality versus like the specific situation. There's still obviously situational impacts on like longevity, but the further and further you get from cause and effect, the harder it is for you to argue that the situation is driving that relationship. Now, another kind of component to this argument, which is why the binomial effect size is a thing, is that a correlation of 0.4 is not small. If you compare it in absolute standards, like versus the number of correct and incorrect predictions, a correlation of 0.4 is the equivalent of a 70% accuracy, which is pretty good. And when you compare this, so like comparing this to a relative standard, how well do situations predict behavior? When we compare using the same metric, guess what? They're equally good. It's just when you look at like a 70 as like accuracy versus a 4.4, 70 is bigger, therefore it's better. That's why it's helpful to put them in the same metric. Now, here's the second argument. That was the first one. We are on to number 2. Situations are more important than personality traits in determining behavior. And how do you do it? You determine how personality affects behavior by correlating personality and behavior. That's the whole deal. You correlate them, see which is bigger. Now, how do you... And here's the technique they use, and it's got huge problems. And I lied. This is a little bit statistical. So how do you determine how the situation affects behavior? Here's the technique they use. And this is an incorrect technique. This is a bad technique. Do not use this. So it's total variance. So like all the variability you could explain, minus the variability you were able to explain with your personality measures. This is not, you can't do this because personality measures are not, whatever measure you pick isn't capturing all of personality. It's only capturing what's explained by your test. And the tests that they use weren't so hot, and so you're missing out on some of the stuff that's personality. Say you have a measure of extroversion and its relationship with whatever the situation is. But extroversion is not a big predictor. Maybe conscientiousness is, but you didn't measure conscientiousness. Using this metric, all the variance that is explained by conscientiousness, which isn't measured in your study, gets counted as situational variance, which is wrong. All it tells you is that here's how much variability was not explained by the tests we used. It could be due to other personality traits that aren't measured. It really says nothing about the important aspects of the situation. It only tells you how useful your measures were. It's not about how much is left unexplained. It's more important to understand what is explained. And so if they had a measure of the situation and you subtracted that from the total variance, that would give you, like, that wouldn't be 100%. And that's what they should have done, but they didn't. So how do you respond to this argument? I mean, I've already given you some of it. So, how do you measure these? So how the effects of situations on behavior should be determined. So do an experiment based on social psychological experiments. You need to put everything into the same metric. And so that's what David Funder and Dan Ozer, also fantastic. Also, he's a great quantitatively inclined personality person. He tends to visit me at my posters, which is really nice. But yeah, so how do you convert these? You need to have everything in the same metric. So most social psychology studies use statistical significance. They evaluate it. You can convert that into like an effect. And if you can calculate how much of any effect is explained by the situation. And it turns out it's about 0.4, which is the same as about how much personality explains. They're both important. And it's not fair to compare apples to oranges. It's not. So put everything in the same metric. That's why Funder is really into the binomial effect size, because it converts the correlation into a metric that social psychologists are familiar with. So here's some examples from their paper, or their paper and a couple of it, or here are the analyses that they did to like convert and make comparable effects. So looking at incentive as impact on attitude change, they found a correlation when they converted of like 0.36. Hurrying and helping, negative 0.4. That's the negative versus positive direction of the effect. Isolation of victim in obedience studies, 0.4. We've seen this in the Milgram data. You might want to recheck out that video or the slides attached to it, because now you've got a little more context. Proximity of authority figure to the impact of obedience, 0.36. These numbers are comparable when you convert them together, instead of just looking at, oh, well, our measure of personality didn't explain that much. Okay, so that's kind of the second little piece here. A response to second situational. Now you also have this interesting piece on absolute versus relative consistency, where they can both be the case. So individual differences are maintained across situations, even when their absolute behavior changes. So like the more extroverted person will behave differently than the least extroverted person. And so those differences like will appear across situations. So like extroversion in like a party versus like extroversion at a funeral. It's going to take a lot more like social nuance to manage that. Like extrovert, like all your professors will be fairly extroverted in front of the classroom. So that situation causes everyone to be more extroverted, but there's still relative differences. So think about it like a ranking. So that's relative consistency. Now, absolute consistency is you do the exact same thing. It's not like relative to other people, it's you do the same thing. So situations will influence behavior. Sure, but people are still consistent. So you can be influenced by the situation, and they both exist. They work together, people, in case that was unclear. And I don't know why I'm doing the airport signal, but I am. Enjoy. Okay, so the third one is that, so here's the third argument, that person perceptions are erroneous. That there's no point, why bother? Don't even bother like trying to perceive like personality. It's just like a fake thing. It just is. Also, there's a super helpful table in the book on page, I think it's 130. It's table 4.6. Before I forget, because I will. So the professional practice of personality assessment, the argument is a waste of utter time, and that everybody's intuition about people are flawed. One kind of broad theme in social psychology is that, and they're generally interested in things that are counterintuitive. And so, of course, they see everything as, oh, well, obviously, counterintuition. The fact that you think people are different from each other, but have, like, consistency across the two, that's obviously wrong, because it's the intuition. So, here's the response to that argument. The effects of personality on behavior are large enough to be perceived accurately. People aren't idiots. Like, this is one of those intuitive things that's true. It just is. A lot of personality psychology kind of confirms intuition, while social psychology disconfirms it. So you can see why there's a little bit of a tension. Just because, like, they're interested in fundamentally different things. Now, we'll talk more about this in a smidge, but the importance of trait is reflected in our language. The fact that lots of different countries and lots of different languages have ways to describe how people differ from each other is indicative that people do differ. If they didn't, we wouldn't have the language for it. We just wouldn't. And we'll talk way more about this idea, this lexical hypothesis, soon. But, like, and the third situational argument's the least, well, compelling or useful. The first two are, like, really where it's at. But for completeness, and it is in the book, so I wanted to make sure to cover it. So yeah, that's it for the arguments. Now, next time, I'm going to talk to you about kind of personality in life. Not from a, like, philosophical standpoint, but to show you, like, what personality does do. Because so far, I've talked to you, how do we measure it? How do we infer causation? I did all the fun stats that I like. And I appreciate your patience of enduring. And now I've talked about what personality isn't, as well as that personality exists. So now, we're going to finally talk about, like, what personality actually predicts. And, like, we're just going to keep like, you're going to finally learn about, like, the content of this class. Not that that stuff isn't content, but, like, we're finally into, like, what it is. So, yeah. So that was this video. Thanks for watching. I, will see you, or, well, no, you will see me in the next video. Feel free to shoot me an email if you are in my class, and ask questions. I mean, you can if you aren't in my class, but I will prioritize student class videos first. Anyway, I'm just going to cut it off here, and next time, we're going to do personality in life. Bye-bye! I'm totally out of frame, I swear.